Good evening to all of you who are here and to everyone who will be watching us on YouTube. In that case, it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you'll watch us. This is the Shastrarth Socratic Society at IIT Gandhinagar. The whole purpose of this society is to engage in the back and forth on issues of importance. We have had a number of distinguished guests. Recently, we had General P.K. Singh. Today, we have someone from an entirely different realm. We have Sanjay Prasad. Now, Sanjay ji is one of the great intellectuals in the government of India. He's a man who has worked in the 14th Finance Commission. He's worked in the health sector. He has read widely, thought deeply, and expressed himself clearly. He's also a man of taste in learning. He has an interest in yoga, in Hindi literature, in particular Hindi poetry. He sends me some of the most sublime poems from time to time. And he has an avid interest in Hindustani classical music. Without further ado, I will not stand between you and the great man of learning we have here today evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Sanjay Prasad.
Thank you, Atulji. My thanks to the Shastrarth Socratic Society for having invited me here. I'm very grateful to Atulji. Atulji, actually, if you could correlate, there's something called Hanuman treatment in Indian mythology. So he's the one who has given me this Hanuman treatment, and that's how I'm here. And this Shastrarth Socratic Society, this name fascinates me no end, because this actually tells me what the society stands for. And for once, it's not Juliet in Romeo and Juliet saying what's in a name, because this society actually tells me that learning will happen, as Mr. Atul Singh said, through back and forth, through reasoning, through debate. It will not happen through rote. It will not happen through the force of, say, authority, by a force of convention. It will all happen through reason. It will all happen through debate. And reason is the prime, what should I say? Reason is the prime contribution of the Greek civilization to science and the world at large. But let me take you back a couple of centuries before the Greeks and Socrates, and cross the Aegean Sea and come to what is now Turkey, and a small coastal area known as Ionia. And Ionia in the 6th century BC gave the world the most versatile thinkers, and there are a number of them. It's the Thales of Metellus, it's Lucretus, it's Democritus. And Democritus I name specifically because, since you are all bright young minds, there is a very highly recommended book by Carlos Revelli. Have you heard of Carlos Revelli? Carlos Revelli works on quantum gravity, and his book, Reality is Not What It Seems, is based on the fundamentals of what Democritus had to say. And Democritus of Ionia had 3 very important formulations. The first was that the world can be understood by reason. Imagine, we are 2600 years back. He says that the world can be understood by reason. That is the first formulation that he made, and what Carlos Revelli writes in his book, Reality is Not What It Seems. I would highly recommend this book to you. He works on quantum gravity, Carlos Revelli. The second thing he says is that reality can be understood by breaking it down into pieces. That is the second formulation. And the third, what he says is, from where we stand on earth, there is no above and there is no below. Can you imagine? These are 3 stunning statements that he made 2600 years back. The first, I'm sure you would relate to reason. No, understanding of the world, you can relate it to Socrates. Second, when he says it can be broken down into pieces and understood like that, who comes to your mind? It's Newton, everyone else, who thought that world can be broken down into pieces and understood like that. And the third, when he says that there is no above and there's nothing above and nothing below in this cosmos. And he talks about the vastness of the space and the vastness of time. And who comes to mind? Einstein. The theory of special and general relativity, where time and space are intertwined. So these are formulations made by the philosophers of Ionia in the 6th century BC. And 6th century BC, let me tell you, before I come to taxation side, which is a more technical subject, if you travel east and come to India in the 6th century BC, two of the greatest soils of this, sons of this soil, who are they? 6th century BC in India, two of them. Can you recollect? 6th century BC in India. One is the 24th Tirthankar, Mahavir, and who is the other one? He is the Gautam the Buddha, 6th century BC. See, it's the flowering of the intellect of the humankind. Travel further east, reach China, 6th century BC. Two of the finest thinkers of China. Who were they? 6th century BC. One was Confucius. The other was Lao Tse. So in the 6th century BC, you find across this spectrum of, say, 30-degree latitude to 50-degree latitudes, 6, 7, 10 of the topmost thinkers of this world. So it's very fascinating to learn that what was picked up by the Greek later on was given to them by the Ionians. We have forgotten the Ionians, but they are the ones who actually were the contributors to the concept of reasoning that the Greek took forward and gave it to the Western world, and from where we all now understand the modern sciences. So now to start my presentation, you will find three important, three important terms. The first is taxation, second is fiscal, and the third is federal. Now tax is something which it's been being paid by everyone since time immemorial. Since the society from hunter-gatherer to became a settled society, the big man, as they say, the big man always collected some tribute. But the taxation that we talk about today is a tax which is being collected by rule of law. Earlier tax was collected by rule by law. There's a difference between rule of law and rule by law. Rule by law doesn't follow the codified system, the procedures, the grievance redressal system. So the king would have, say, decreed that from tomorrow we'll collect 30%. So this is rule by law. The king has decreed so. But now that we have today is rule of law. So you have a tax code. You have the tax authorities defined. The budget is presented. The tax rates are fixed. What is to be taxed? How it is to be taxed? If you are aggrieved, what is the grievance redressal mechanism? So these are all the facets of rule of law. Second is fisc. What is the fisc? Now, fisc is something which is a very modern concept. States from the 19th and the 20th century, when they started to collect taxes, the onus was on them also to give back in terms of building of roads, running of hospitals, building of schools. So it's a two-way traffic between the people who pay taxes and they expect certain services in return. So the fiscal side of it is what is being collected and what is given back in terms of, say, highway, ports, telecom, all this is part of that fiscal thing. And federal. Federal means, you understand federalism? Federal means a government wherein there are more than one tier. There are 2 tiers. It can be 3 tiers. All of them are assigned by the constitution. Their roles are fixed, their duties are fixed, their rights are fixed. And each one has its own separate mechanisms and means of raising taxes and governance. So what I'm trying to do today is to find the common between how tax is collected and how through the method of fiscal federalism, it is given back. So the combination of the two. Okay. And this is the structure of the presentation. Taxation will go through the history, its constitutional provisions, direct taxes, indirect taxes, the federalism, the salient features, fiscal federalism, vertical and horizontal devolution, constitutional provisions, the special features of Indian federalism, then the salient recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission, 15th Finance Commission, the important issues. You'll be aware the 15th Finance Commission is currently deliberating what should be the recommendations effective from 2020 to 2024. And then I would also like you to go through some of the important numbers in the union budget, because we keep hearing about fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, this much is collected, this much is spent, and we have very vague idea of what the government is talking about. So I would like to go through some of those to make you aware of those aspects. This is a very telling comment which is attributed to Benjamin Franklin, which said that as long as you're alive, you pay taxes. All of us are taxpayers here. Even if you buy a matchbox, you pay tax. And you earn, tomorrow you will go to high paying jobs, you will earn a lot of money, but you will pay tax. You will save, you will put it in your bank, you will pay tax. If you acquire a capital asset, you sell it, you will pay tax. In fact, till 1980s, India also had something called the estate duty tax. Means once the person was dead and his property passed on to his heir, he had to, that even then tax had to be paid. So tax is everywhere. So this is what Franklin had to say. This is the history of taxation. I wouldn't like you to go through all this very dense writings in the slide, but the important thing that I want for you to understand is that taxation has been around since human beings got together in an organized fashion. So tax had to be collected because the government had to run. At that point in time, mostly for raising an army, because the kings existed either to plunder or to survive. There was no fixed government as such as we have today in the modern world. Come to the fourth bullet. We have two important ancient thinkers. There were several, but the two important thinkers are Manu and Kautilya. You must have heard about both of them. Now, Manu's Smriti and Kautilya's Arthashastra. These are the two basic texts on taxation in the ancient system. Now, this Manu Smriti is also a very important and a very fascinating concept. Why do we call it as Manu Smriti? Any idea about that? Manu Smriti. Manu's Smriti. India was traditionally a land of oral traditions. We have transmitted our traditions orally. Very little was written down. Whatever was written down was probably a very minuscule proportion of what was available in the society as wisdom and knowledge and intellect. So we had two forms of oral traditions. One was the Shruti. You understand Shruti? Shruti means to hear, and Smriti means to remember. What are the most famous Shrutis? Any idea? The most famous Shrutis of India are the Ved. Ved are the Shrutis. So the Samhit, you know, there are four parts of the Ved. It's the Samhit, the Brahmans, the Aranyaks, and the Upanishads. So these are the parts of what we call as the Ved or the Vedas. Consist of these four parts. The Samhit, which are the mantras, how to conduct a yagya. So this is the Samhit, the Brahmans, the Aranyak, and the Upanishad. So these are the Shrutis. And then we have the Smritis. Smritis are, if you would call it, the little traditions. So we have, say, Ramayana and the Mahabharata. These are part of the Smritis. So you will find several several forms of smritis. So the Mahabharata of Bengal would be very different from the Mahabharata of, say, Rajasthan. And therefore, you are still very young. When we were in college, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana serial were being telecast. And there used to be a lot of debate on the accuracy of what was being depicted, because each one had heard Ramayana in his own part of the world, which seemed to be in variance from what was being shown. So these are the little traditions of India. If we have time, we'll go through the concept of great traditions and little traditions. But Smriti, and I just thought you must also know what are the traditions of the country. And Artha Shastra. Now, Kautilya's Artha Shastra is the most elaborate treatise on taxation in the ancient world. And I will just pick one of them, which is this. Now, I would like your attention not to the income tax department, but this. Can you read it from there? It is Kosh Mulo Danda. So, what do you understand of that? Kosh means? Kosh means? No. No. Kosh means? Kosh means your khajana. Kosh. So when you say dictionary, it's the khajana of words. Sabd Kosh is the khajana. That's your treasury. That's your treasury. And then Mulo. Anyone who's aware of Sanskrit? Mulo. Mool means base. Mool. Okay. When we say iska mool kya hai, mool arth kya hai? Mool means the basic. So danda. Dand would mean what? Dand would mean the true. But who gives punishment? Those in authority. So what he wants to say is that the basis of a strong ruler is the treasury. And that is the motto of the income tax department. So if you want to be a strong ruler, your treasury should be full. So Kosh is the mool of Danda. This is picked up from Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now, I would just like you to focus on what is written in navy blue, because here what I want you to understand is that, you know, when I say rule of law means there has to be legitimacy of whatever I do. Whenever I sign an order and I say you have to pay 50,000 rupees as tax, there has to be legitimacy in that order. And where does this legitimacy come from? The legitimacy comes from my being an authority in the income tax department. And where does the authority of my being in the income tax department comes from? Because of the Income Tax Act. And where does the Act draw its authority from? From the Constitution. And where does the Constitution draw the authority from? From the preamble of the Constitution. Do you remember the preamble of the Constitution? First line, what do we say? We say, we the people of India, having solemnly decided to constitute ourselves into a democratic, socialist, so-and-so, and give to ourselves this constitution. You must have read the preamble to the Constitution. So, sovereign democratic republic, yes. To socialists. Yeah. So what I want to say here is that the legitimacy of any act is ultimately the people. We provide legitimacy to the Constitution. The Constitution has provisions which provides legitimacy to the acts, and the acts provide legitimacy to the functionaries like me. So it's the function of legitimacy, and therefore we call it as rule of law. Now 246A, so you'll be aware that law is, who would make law is based on the constitutional provisions. And there is something called the 7th schedule to the Constitution. 7th schedule actually of the Constitution defines as to who will make law in a federal system. So the union government is given a set of items on which the union government can make laws. The state government has been given a set of items on which the state government can make laws. So the first one is called the union list, the second one is called the state list, and there is a third one which is known as the concurrent list. And then the constitution also says that whatever has not been listed there would be the residuary list on which the union can make laws. But what happened, so since 1950, when was the constitution adopted? 26th of November 1949. And when was the constitution enacted? Adopted and enacted are two different words. When was it enacted? 26th of January 1950. So from 1950 we have this constitution which has undergone several amendments. Therein, the union government was authorized to make laws on income. The state government was authorized to make laws on goods, trading of goods, etc. Now, you must have heard about GST, Goods and Service Tax. Goods and Service Tax is a landmark act wherein the union government gave up its sovereign right on certain items of legislation, and in turn the state governments also gave up its sovereign right on certain items of taxation, and they combined it together, and this was the amendment made. Notwithstanding anything contained in so and so, Parliament and subject to so and so, the legislature of every state have power to make laws with respect to goods and service. Now, service was completely in the realm of the union government, but with this amendment, the state government also was authorized to make laws on services. Similarly, sales tax was completely in the realm of the state government, but now the union government was also, so this is a quid pro quo on which the GST is rested. So 246A of the constitution is very important in terms of our fiscal federalism, because the whole basis of the GST Act is this. I have just listed out some of the constitutional provisions. So entry number 82 of the union list, I'm talking about the union list here, is tax on income, tax on customs. Customs would mean what? Anything which is being imported. So the union government levies a custom duty on them. So this is customs, excise on tobacco and goods manufactured, corporation tax, which is the tax paid by the corporates like Tatas and the Reliances. So these are, and some of them I have just listed down, but the emphasis here was most on income, custom, excise and corporation. And then these are the provisions on which the state government can make laws, and you will find agriculture at the top. Some very learned people also have written articles saying that why shouldn't agriculture be taxed, and why is the union government enacting laws to tax agriculture. Now the fundamental issue is that union government doesn't have the power to enact any legislation to tax agriculture, because as I said, only that part of the federal structure can enact laws and legislation which falls in the realm of the powers of that part of the federal structure. So agriculture is the state list. Agriculture and the other items, tax, say entry number 54, sale of goods, purchase of goods, etc. But now with the GST, the state governments are also authorized to make laws on services and goods, while the union government also can make laws on services and goods. So 246A, as I showed you earlier, gives the authority to both the levels of the government. Now, direct taxes in India has this history. The very important date you will find is 1860. Now, 1860 is, if you look at 1860, there are certain things which has preceded 1860. Some of them are, very good. 1857, the first war of Indian independence has ended, and after which, through a Government of India Act, the authority to run the affairs of the Indian territory is taken over by the British Crown. So that happens in 1858. Then even in British, in England, they have just been through with the Crimean War, 1854 to 1857. A very important report in the British Parliament was tabled, known as the Trevelyan Northcote Report, which actually transformed the way the civil services will work there, the taxation will work there. And then something also very important happened just a year ahead, which I would rank among 3 of the most important scientific works of all time. One was, say, Principia Mathematica, Newton, then the special and the general relativity theories of Einstein, and something happened in 1859. What could that be? It's not related to taxation, but it's related to science. Darwin's On the Origin of Species. That book was published in 1859, and that revolutionized the way we think about ourselves. And you'd be surprised to know that Darwin came back from his world tour in 1839 when he formulated this idea of On the Origin of Species. And it was so much against the grain of normal wisdom of that time that he did not publish it for 20 years. His essay was written in 1839. And what prompted him to do it? He received an essay from another scientist known as Robert Wallace, who also was working on similar lines. And Robert Wallace sent him his own essay and his conclusions, which was strikingly similar to that of Darwin. And Darwin then thought that I will miss out, and he rushed to a publisher and got his On the Origins of Species published. So can you imagine, even somebody of Darwin's stature underwent 20 years of uncertainty on whether his formulations, whether his thesis, whether his conclusions were right. So for 20 years he waited, and in 1859 he published, no, not related to taxation, but I thought it will be of interest to you. So 1860 is when the direct tax was introduced in the country. In the income tax department, we have had 2 tax codes. Tax code means the act of the 1922 and the 1861. Earlier, both the direct and the indirect taxes boards were together, meaning the income tax Central Board of Direct Taxes and the Central Board of Excise and Customs. They were merged together, and they were bifurcated in 1963. The current tax code that is being implemented today is 1961. The indirect taxes in India, this is the history. 1935 is when these tax on sale of good was introduced. Now 1935 also is very important because something preceded 1935. What all preceded? See, you must have heard about the civil disobedience movement, the Dandi March, the Salt Satyagraha, and the Simon Commission report. All this preceded, and this 1935 Government of India Act was largely based on the Simon Commission report, wherein they decided to, and in 1935 the English thought that they were in a long haul, they were going to rule India for the next 100 years. So they were thinking in those terms. Now that we have introduced direct taxes, how to introduce indirect taxes, how to collect more taxes, etc., etc. So from there onwards, come to 2006 and 7. That's the second, the last but one bullet from below. That is first time GST was negotiated, and that will tell you how much time we take to reach a goal. So it took us 11 years from the budget speech to introduction of GST. And you would have found a lot of people saying ki abhi bhi hadbad ho gayi. We should have waited for some more time. We were discussing, deliberating it for 11 years. And you would be surprised, there are 161 countries which have introduced GST, of which Bangladesh, can you imagine when Bangladesh would have introduced GST? 1991. Even Bangladesh introduced GST in 1991, and we kept on deliberating about GST till 2006-7. But now it is being implemented, and it's expected that it will actually give a huge boost to the Indian economy by simplifying taxes. Now, this, some part of it we have actually gone through, but I would invite your attention to the last bullet, that is to ensure financial autonomy, because each government, as we saw, Kosh, Mulo, Danda, with each level of the government needs some kind of financial strength, money in the treasury. So in the federal system, each level of government has to have some kind of power to tax. Now in the Indian federalism, some of the important aspects you must keep in mind is a very important article 368, that gives the power to the union parliament, the Parliament of India, to amend any part of the constitution. Now this is a power of such wide import that immediately after we got independence and the Constitution of India was enacted, the government got into a conflict with the judiciary. Government wanted to enact a lot of laws which went against the fundamental rights. For example, right to property, right, because the zamindari system was abolished, and these were in complete conflict with the fundamental rights. So whatever government would propose, the courts will say that this is unconstitutional. So that resulted in a very famous case of Golaknath. A Golaknath case is one of the most famous cases in the realm of Indian constitution development. In the case of Golaknath, the Supreme Court said that fundamental rights cannot be abridged or modified, against which the government brought in the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, saying that 368 is a supreme power given to the Parliament of India, and the Parliament of India can change any part of the Constitution. Then came the judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Keshwanand Bharti. This Keshwanand Bharti case is a landmark case in the constitution history of the country, wherein for the first time the basic structure of a doctrine was discussed. The Supreme Court said that the Parliament of India can amend certain portions of the constitution but cannot alter and change the basic structure. Now this fiscal federalism also is part of the basic structure, and therefore when the government of India said that the goods and services tax would need to be enacted, it needed to have the support of at least 50% of the states, and then only the GST could come into force. So basic structure of the constitution is one of the doctrines which is very special to Indian federalism. Then ratification of the states, as we just discussed. The 7th schedule, we have just finished those because therein the items of legislation and the items are already fixed. And from 1980s, you would see that till 1980, it was the Congress which was the party in power at the center, and the Congress was in power in the states also. So it seemed more like a unitary state, because the same party was in power in the state governments and the union government. But from 1980 onwards, this thing changed, because a lot of regional leaders, N.T. Ramarao, the DMK, later on Lalu Yadav in Bihar, Biju Patnaik, these were the regional leaders who then cast a check on the powers of the union government, and these are very special features of the Indian federalism. Fiscal federalism we have already discussed. You would see that government collects taxes from the citizens and benefits flow back to the citizens. Now in our country, which state do you come from? Maharashtra. And you? How about you? And you, ma'am? Haryana. See, all these are developed states of the country. Haryana, Maharashtra, these are the developed states of the country, wherein the state is capable of raising a lot of revenue, because there's a lot of economic activity happening in these states. But think about, say, Manipur, think about Mizoram, think about Jharkhand. These states do not have the capacity to raise revenue, and therefore, first of all, there is an imbalance between the capacity to raise resources of the union government and the state governments. As you would see, the union government has more capacity to raise resources, and the state governments have much less. As even amongst the states, a state of Maharashtra would be able to raise huge amount of revenue, but that might not be the case with, say, Orissa or Jharkhand or Tripura. Now, what is the mechanism to balance it out? So this is the core item of fiscal federalism, as to how how the mechanism is to be developed so as to ensure that even states like Manipur and Tripura and Bihar get enough revenue to provide basic services to a citizen in terms of, say, health services, roads, schools, etc. Fiscal federalism in India also underwent through various stages. There were two Government of India Acts. You would be aware, you would have read in your class 10, I don't know whether you remember those, 1919 and 1935. And in 1935 Government of India Act, the provision was made wherein the tax collected by the British government at the union level was to be distributed amongst the various states at that point in time governed by the British. You will be aware, the British did not govern the whole of the country at that time. When we got independence, you will be surprised to know that there were how many princely states at that point in time? There were 565. Those were not directly ruled by the British. Though they were controlled by the British, but they had a titular king. For example, the king of Junagadh, the king of, say, Hyderabad. These were kings who administered their own territory, but the British actually ran the show from behind. But the territory administered, ruled by the British government, the taxes were raised by the British, and through this act, some part of it was given back to the provincial government, because the provincial governments also got elected at that point in time. And then there is a provision under the Indian Constitution to establish and to set up the Finance Commission. So that is where our core theme of the lecture lies. So the Finance Commission, which will come in, which we'll see in the next slide, the Finance Commission is set up under the provisions of the Constitution under Article 280. And the Government of India is obliged to set up a Finance Commission every 5 years. And what is the core mandate of the Finance Commission? The core mandate of the Finance Commission is to give recommendations on the distribution between union and states of the net proceeds of taxes. So when we say net proceeds of taxes, we mean the union government collected 100 rupees, the cost of collection was, say, 2 rupees. So the union government has borne the cost also. So the net tax collected is 98 rupees, and on which the Finance Commission will give its recommendation as to how it's to be distributed. Then, even after distribution of taxes, some states require more money. So the Finance Commission is also expected to provide recommendation on how to fill that gap. As to supposing the state of Bihar required, say, 100 rupees. Through the formula, the amount devolved was, say, 95 rupees. So there would be some grant, say 5 rupees would be the grant, which will fill in that gap of 5 rupees. So the Finance Commission gives recommendations on those also. And the Finance Commission also gives recommendation on what would be the measures to augment the consolidated fund of the state. There are two consolidated funds. One is the consolidated fund of the union, and one is the consolidated fund of the state. So in the Indian federal system, how many structures do we have? How many structures do we have? We have three. One is the union government, one is the state government, and one is the third tier, as we known as the local self-government. The local self-government came into existence after the 73rd and the 74th amendment to the Constitution in 1991. So now, since they are also the third tier of the Indian federalism, they also need to have some money, because kosh is the mool of their danda. So the Finance Commission is also expected to give recommendations on how the consolidated fund of the state is to be augmented so that money flows into the municipalities and the panchayats. Now, read the bullet in red. Surcharge on certain duties and taxes for the purpose of the union. Now, this is a very contentious issue. You would have read that there is a certain portion of tax on which certain amount of surcharge is levied, on which certain amount of cess is levied. Now, why this is important? Because though tax is shared between the state and the union, surcharge and cess is not shared. Because surcharge and cess is not tax. And the state governments are very upset about that. State governments say that if you need to impose a surcharge, do it temporarily. for a couple of years, maybe there's some calamity which has happened in the country for which you need to have, say, supposing if we have 30% of tax and 10% of surcharge. So actually your tax becomes 33%. 30 and 10% of 30, so it's 33%. But the Finance Commission will give its recommendation only on the sharing of 30 and not on that 3. That 3 goes entirely to the union government and the cess on that. So the state governments say that we are deprived of, ideally if you have, say if you recommend that 50% should go to the state government, it should be of 33 rupees and not 30 rupees. But, and therefore they have a objection to the levy of surcharge and cess. But since surcharge and cess is levied and kept by the union government. Now, there used to be 3 mechanisms of transfer. Now, Finance Commission is the only one. But earlier, come to the second and the third bullet, you would recollect that once India became independent, we entered an era of planned development. Nehru was in favor of planned development, and therefore we started formulating the 5-year plans from 1952 onwards. We had several plans of 5 years, and therefore to oversee the plan and to have a synchronicity between the union plans and the state government plans, the Planning Commission was set up. The Planning Commission's job was to see that the plans of the state governments were synchronous with the union plans. And in the process, the Planning Commission also became a dispenser of funds to the state governments through the ministries, because they were the ones who would approve even the state plans. Now, state governments had a serious objection to the existence and the functioning of the Planning Commission, because they said that we are constitutional functionaries, we are elected by the people, but Planning Commission is an executive body. It doesn't have any authority in law. But the state chief ministers and the finance ministers would need to come to the Planning Commission to get their plans approved. And therefore, in 1914, when the present government came into power, it abolished the Planning Commission and substituted it with what? What is in place of Planning Commission now? Have you heard of Niti Aayog? Niti Aayog. But Niti Aayog doesn't give advice on plan. Niti Aayog is basically a think tank. But Planning Commission was very powerful. The Prime Minister used to be the chairperson of the Planning Commission. And you would have heard of a person called Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was probably the last deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. And then the National Development Council also was set up by Prime Minister Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru in 1952 to bring in all the chief ministers under one roof, so that the planned development of the country can happen through the approval of the National Development Council, which used to approve the national plans. But now the Planning Commission has already been abolished. The importance of National Development Council also has been greatly diminished. We don't have, I don't think that this National Development Council has met for the last 2-3 years, or maybe even more. Now, the important development constitutionally, after the 73rd and the 74th Amendment of the Constitution, which actually set up the third tier of the fiscal of Indian federalism, that is the municipalities and the panchayats, the Constitution was amended and it was mandated. The states also would set up a similar State Finance Commission, which will give similar recommendations to the state governments as to how the funds is to be devolved to the panchayats and the municipalities. That has not been very successful, because any government to function needs 3 aspects, which is generally known as 3 F's. The first is functions, the second is functionaries, and the third is fund. So functions would be akin to what we have under the 7th schedule. What functions? What should the municipality do? Clean roads, clean the drain, street lights. So these are the functions. To implement those, you will need functionaries, means the people who are employed in the municipalities and the panchayats. And to pay them, to do these services, to provide those services, you would need funds. But unfortunately, though the functions have been transferred by law, the functionaries and the funds haven't come. And therefore, in India, you would find that most of the municipalities, we rue the fact that our municipalities are not working very well. But we don't realize that they don't have the functionaries and the funds. You are too young to remember, but when the 9/11 in the US happened, 9/11? When the two Twin Towers were brought down. At that time in India, we only used to hear about a person called Rudy Giuliani. He was the mayor of New York. Can you imagine this thing happening in India? If something was to go wrong in, say, Gandhinagar or Ahmedabad or Delhi, would we ever know or would we ever believe that the person in charge would be the mayor of that city? But Rudy Giuliani, I still remember 17 years back, because he was the one who used to give press conferences. He was the one who seemed to be in charge of all the rescue operations. Because those municipalities are empowered. Those municipalities have the funds, they have the functionaries, and they have the functions. We don't have the funds and the functionaries. So I'm not saying that the municipalities are working very well within the confines of whatever is available with them, but the legal aspect is that the municipality cannot recruit. The municipality has very limited amount of tax raising powers, and what comes from the state government also is very minuscule, and therefore we find our municipalities and the panchayats in the shape that they are. Now these are the very special features of our fiscal federalism. There's an article 293. Now 293 is the article which gives the power of the state government to raise loans from the market. State government also is in need of loans, and they can go to the market to raise loans. Now if that was completely unfettered, what would happen? The state governments can go to the market and borrow huge amounts of money, but ultimately it's the union government which has the final say on RBI, banks, money printing. So under 293, the constitution says, our constitution is a beautifully drafted constitution. I don't think there's any other constitution which is so beautifully drafted. The fact that we have not implemented it very well is a separate matter altogether. So if the state government, for example, Gujarat wants to raise a loan, it cannot go to the market and sell bonds. It has to go to the union government and give an undertaking. And that is how the union government keeps a check, because the ultimate sovereign is the union government. So if the state government goes bankrupt, who is going to bail it out? It will be the union government. It has not happened. But one very critical aspect of our fiscal federalism is that under Article 293, till the state is indebted to the union government, which all states are, till the states are indebted to the union government, they cannot go and borrow from the market unless they get a green signal from the union government. That is Article 293. And then Planning Commission we have already discussed. Special category states you must be reading in the newspapers. Some states are asking for special category status, and I think there is a bandh today in Andhra Pradesh for that purpose. But special category state is a very specific formulation for those states which had difficult terrain, international boundaries, low population base. They were given special category state status, and they comprised of the 8 states of the northeast, Uttarakhand, Himachal, and Jammu Kashmir. So these were the 11 special category states wherein the funding pattern from the union government was more lenient. The state would receive funds on more lenient terms. Andhra Pradesh now wants it, Bihar also is asking for it, but the crucial factor is that special category state was meant for those states. Say for example, Uttarakhand or Himachal, it's absolutely hilly. Where do they get their resources from? Except for tourism, they cannot set up factories. It's easy to set up factory in, say, Maharashtra or Haryana. You have markets, you have flat land. But in a mountainous terrain or very far away from the market, who would like to go and set up a factory in Mizoram? The market is so far away from there, and therefore it was imperative for a harmonious growth of the country that there were some mechanisms wherein these states were also financially incentivized. But the 14th Finance Commission recommended that you do away with the special category states and give them more funds in lieu of that. Then the centrally sponsored schemes. You are aware of National Health Mission, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, all these things are the schemes which are run by the union government, in which the state government also puts in its own share. So these are, for example, Manrega stands for Mahatma Gandhi National Employment Guarantee Scheme Act, wherein people are guaranteed 100 days of job if they cannot find any. So these are the centrally sponsored scheme wherein the union government pays a substantial part of the amount, while the state government also chips in. This union government also runs certain central sector schemes, like you would have heard about Namami Gange and the LPG scheme, the Ujala scheme, wherein all 100% of the funding is done by the central government. So this is a distinction between centrally sponsored scheme and the central sector scheme. Centrally sponsored schemes are those schemes wherein the state government and the union government share in the proportion of say 65-35, 70-30, at times 80-20, while the central sector schemes would be completely 100% funded by the union government. So we have the MP lads, Stand Up India. Namami Gange is a program of the current government to cleanse Ganga, to make it a pristine river as it was earlier. So there is a distinction between centrally sponsored and central sector, and this is also a very special feature of our federalism, because it is where the central government starts funding certain items of activity which the state government ought to have run. For example, primary education is part of the agenda or the function of the state government, but through Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, by paying 65% of the funds to run a primary school, the government of India also intervenes in the functions of the state government as to how it is to be run. Now we come to the recommendations of the Finance Commission. The recommendations of the Finance Commission are very important because of several factors. We had 13 Finance Commissions prior to the Finance Commission 14th, and the devolution that the commissions have recommended from 1st to 13 had moved up to 32%. The Finance Commission 14th gave a quantum jump to the devolution as it recommended that it should be moved from 32 to 42%. So this was a huge jump, because 10% extra union taxes moving to the state is a huge amount of money. And then the Finance Commission also has a formula on which the devolution is to happen. Tomorrow some state can come and say as to why did you give Maharashtra so less and Bihar so much. So this there is a transparent formula. The formula is based on what you see in the red, which is fiscal capacity and income distance. Now this is a technical term for how poor is the state as compared to the most developed state. Now in the 14th Finance Commission, they took Haryana as the most developed state. So the GSDP means the gross state domestic product of the state of Haryana would be taken as the base, and the state, as they go down the ladder further from Haryana, would be compensated for the distance of because the underlying concept is that each citizen of the country is entitled to same set of government services. And since the government of a poor state is not able to provide for those, and therefore it has to be compensated to see that at least they have funds enough as the government of Haryana has to provide for those services. So this is fiscal capacity. Now population and demographic change. Now if you are reading the newspapers these days, you would find there's a huge amount of controversy on this. What population base is to be taken? So the 14th Finance Commission, the population base that was to be taken was 1971, though the government said that while doing so, you may also take into consideration the demographic changes from 71 onwards. So the Finance Commission 14 said that okay, we'll have 17.5% of the population which was existing in 1971, but we'll also give 10% weightage to the 2011 population. Now the controversy which has risen currently is that some states in 1971 had a larger proportion of their population vis-a-vis the Indian population. But since they have implemented the family planning programs well, so now the proportion, you understand the proportionality you had, say, for example, in 1971, the state of Tamil Nadu would have, say, 5% of the population. Now the population has moved from 100 to 150, but Tamil Nadu has not moved from 5 to 10. Tamil Nadu has moved only from 5 to, say, 8. So as a proportion of total population, its population has come down. So when you give a weightage of population of 2011, it will be disadvantageous to the state of, say, Tamil Nadu or any other state where the population growth has declined, while the state which has grown in population will tend to gain more. So the southern states today are agitating as to why 2011 should be taken as the population base. But I'll just give you one number. Our population in 1971 was 54 crores. In 2011, it was 121 crores. Now you judge for yourself whether the population base of 1971 at all is relevant. But this is the controversy which is raging at the moment. The states which have done well on family planning programs say that we shouldn't be penalized for doing something which is beneficial to the nation. But at the same time, we have to understand that the population of 71 has grown more than 2.5 times. So once the citizens are citizens of the country, nobody can say that since you are in UP, you will not get enough money for your government to run the basic services that the citizen needs. Then area is very important because area is where the government provides services. So area is given 15% coverage and forest cover, because the states say that forest provides for externality, means if I have forest cover, it provides externality in terms of, say, soil conservation, flow of river, cleaning of the atmosphere. But since I have forest, I am not able to set up my factories. So I am at a disadvantage because I am having forest, so you compensate me for that. So the 14th Finance Commission devised this formula by which the devolution was recommended, and it was something like this. For Gujarat, they had 3.084. Any other state that you are interested in? Maharashtra had 5.521. Haryana, where is Haryana? Haryana had 108. Based on those weightages, this is how much was recommended, and you will find that the states of UP got 17.959 because it's most populous and poor also. Bihar got 9.665, another very populous state and a poor state. So if you have large population and your income distance means you are poorer, you get favored. And currently the recommendations of the Finance Commission, they are in existence for 5 years. So the 14th Finance Commission's recommendation started from 2015-16 till 2019-20, after which the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission will be implemented till 2024. The commission has already been set up. They are working on what formula should be devised for devolution for the next 5 years. And the challenges before them, I have identified 4 or 5 of them. One is how the GST would define the revenues of the union and the states. GST was implemented last year in August. So it has just settled down. How much of revenue would, earlier for the last 60 years, the union government knew that I will get revenue from excise, customs, while the state governments knew that they will get revenue from sales tax and VAT. But now since both of them are merged, so what course will it take is something which is in the realm of our future. So they'll have to see as to how the revenues in the coming 5 years will pan out. Then international trade, the headwinds in international trade. You would have read about the protective trade measures implemented by the government of US and the retaliation by China and the counter retaliation by US. This is going to impact international trade, and how this is going to impact is also something which will have to be factored. Then fiscal discipline of the union and the states. How much are they going to spend and how much are they going to earn? So are they going to implement populist measures which do not give back any kind of fiscal benefit, or would they be tight on their fiscal side? and the use of population base of 2011. The current Finance Commission has been told to use the 2011 population base. Some of the states are not very happy with that, and proposing measurable performance-based incentive for the states as to how the states are to be incentivized to perform on those parameters which lead to better performance, better governance of the states. Now, after completing this, let me take you through some of the important figures of the budget. Just the last column. This is the 1890, the budget estimates. Now you look at the figures. The total revenue receipts of the government is 17,25,000 crores, out of which the government expects to earn around 14,80,000 crores from taxes. Now this is the GST and the income tax, and then another 2,45,000 crores from non-tax revenue. Now what are the sources of non-tax revenue? Non-tax revenue to the government comes from the spectrum sale. A government has sold spectrum to, say, Airtel and Jio and Vodafone. They have to pay to the government certain amounts. The government also earns non-tax revenue from dividends from companies. Some profitable PSUs like Coal India, ONGC, they pay dividend to the government, and that is the source of non-tax revenue. So put together, the total revenue receipt of the government is expected to be 17,25,000 crores. And the government also expects to earn from recovery of loans. This 12,199 is the recovery of loans, of those loans which the state union government had given to the state governments, and the state governments are now paying back. And then other receipts of 80,000 crores. 80,000 crores of other receipt is generally called as non-debt capital receipt. Non-debt capital receipt is basically the disinvestment made. The government disinvests. You would have heard about the disinvestment made in various government companies for BPCL, RPC. Government owns a lot of these companies. So when the government makes disinvestments, the government earns money. So this is known as non-debt capital receipt. Government expects to earn 80,000 crores through non-debt capital receipts. And the balance of 6,24,000 crore is what the government is proposing to lift from the market as loan, and which is the fiscal deficit of the government. Now, this figure is very important. We'll come to that. So the total receipt is 24,42,000 crore is what the government is expecting to have in its kitty in the kosh. And the expenditure is on revenue account is 21,41,000 crores. Revenue means all the expenditure that the government makes on salaries, on construction, on various other items. And you look at the interest payment, which is very important. It's 5,75,000. So if the government raises 6,24,000 crores, it is paying back 7,75,000 crores just to service that earlier loan, the accumulated loan that the government has. So we have reached a stage wherein we raise. Can you imagine if you are running a household, you borrow 100 rupee, and then you have an interest out of that 85 rupees go back only in paying your interest of the previous loans that you have borrowed. So it's a very, what should I say, not the finances not in good health, I would say so. And then of which interest payment is 5,75,000 crores. Grants in aid for creation of capital asset, that is what the union government gives to the state governments as grant, but the state government uses for construction of hospitals and schools, so those are capital assets. And on capital account, so this 3 lakh crore is all that the government spends on capital asset of all that 24,42,000 crores. Now you would understand, a capital asset is something which is going to give you revenue in the future. So if you are not able to spend or invest as much in capital assets, that means your scope for future earning is always constricted. You are not investing enough so as to give you future earnings. So that is all. When we hear about the government of India spending in roads and ports and buildings and all that, it's 3 lakh crores. Now, once you take all these figures, the revenue deficit is 10 minus 1. state government. But in the books of the union government, since it is grant, it is treated as, so this is a correction, it's a corrective figure. So if I have given a state government 100 rupees, out of which the state government is going to utilize 50 for construction of a factory, then that 50 is treated as grants in aid for creation of capital assets. So revenue. Yeah, so it's 5, exactly. Yes, yes. Yeah, yes, exactly. All union government and the state government put together is 4,96,000. Yes. So that's the sad part of it. We are not investing enough. We are not able to invest enough. And then when we talk about revenue deficit, you must be hearing this term out, revenue deficit. What is the revenue deficit? It's 10 minus 1. So out of this 21,41,000 crore, you reduce 1, that is 17,25,000. So that is the revenue deficit. Then we also hear about the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is nothing but the borrowings that you make from the market. Now, fiscal deficit is very important because of several factors. First is, if the government of India intervenes in the market and borrows 6,24,000 crores from the market, the fund available for the private sector is less by that much of amount. The amount that the banks can lend to the entire, say, if you have a universe of say 100 rupees, which could be lent, the government of India picks up 80 rupees. So the balance 20 rupees alone is available to be funded to various private sector through which investments are made. And as we have seen, the borrowing of the government of India, a large part of it goes back for payment of the earlier loans. Secondly, if the government of India intervenes heavily in the market, the interest rates go up. And therefore, for the private sector, because the money available is less and the laws of demand and supply apply. So if you have less money available to be given to the private sector, the interest rates will be higher. So the cost of investment goes up, and the investment in the economy, which is known as the gross value addition, also comes down. And therefore, to contain fiscal deficit is very important. This is a chart which shows as to how the money is collected. So you will find around 35% of that comes from corporate taxes and income tax, and about the same percent gets collected from customs, excise and GST. It's 35 and 35. So 70 out of every rupee, 70 rupee get collected from these two agencies. And then the non-tax revenue, non-debt capital receipt, as we said, the disinvestment, and the borrowings and other liabilities. Now, if I had the pie chart for earlier years, you would find that this 19 was earlier, 18 and 17, so this is growing. Every year this is growing.
Corporation tax is collected by IRS?
Yes, corporate tax is the tax paid by the corporates. And this 35% of the total 1 rupee collected by the direct taxes and the indirect taxes actually amounts to 6 and 6.1% of the GDP. So the union government, the direct and indirect taxes collect around 12.1%, which is quite low in comparison if you compare it with the developed countries, wherein the tax collected by them would be in the realm of even 30%. If you go to the Scandinavian countries, they are above 40%, and therefore their services are of such world class because the government has huge amount of money. Ours is 12%, add 6% from the state government, so 18% is all that is collected by way of taxes. And this is the trend of deficit. So the fiscal deficit, as you would see, was much higher in 2009-10, has come down. In the year 2017-18, it has gone up because of two reasons. The first is that the economy slowed down because of demonetization and GST. And GST also meant, if you have if you had watched the presentation of budget by the finance minister, because in the current year, the GST of only 11 months was collected because of the typical nature of GST collection, which is a destination-based tax. But next year, it is expected to come down to 3.3. The aim is to have GST at 3%. So that is all that I have to present before you. Since I was in a technical institute, I thought this would be an apt way to to conclude my, thank you very much.